Hello, everyone! Welcome to Through Time and Clades. My name is Joan,
And I'm Albert.
and we are back, fresh off the heels of our very first interview that we had with Miles Greb and Trey the Explainer, and oh my gosh, was that an absolute delight.
Mm.
And the reception has been very positive as well, and so we're glad you all enjoyed that.
hmm
We're definitely looking forward to future interviews with surprise guests in the near future, so yeah, our show is continuing to expand. And so all good things, all good things. Albert, how have things been on your end? I understand you have some exciting news to share with us.
Yeah, I suppose you could say that. So, as I mentioned in, I think, the previous news episode, perhaps, um, my PhD Viva happened last month. So, in fact, I think in less than a week after we did the interview episode, um, was when it took place. And so the PhD Viva is, at least here in the UK, it is equivalent to what we would call a PhD defense in the US, but it is formatted a bit differently. Like in a PhD defense in the US, it is often the grad student is presenting their work, and there's like a whole panel. They have an entire like committee of faculty members on their kind of assessing their PhD, and the committee members will ask questions and such, and oftentimes those defenses can be public affairs. Like you can invite people to come watch it, and there's like a whole audience kind of observing observing your presentation and the subsequent questioning. And things are pretty different in the UK format, where it's, at least by default, it's pretty much just you and your examiners, and you don't have like a lot of examiners, but instead, in my case, I had two. So one from the same institution that I'm from, and which is called the internal examiner, and one who is often like an expert in the subject matter that you study, but from an external institution, so the external examiner. And so my internal examiner at the University of Bath, which is the institution awarding my PhD, was Dr. Daniel Henk, who studies fungi, basically. So quite different from what I do, but he's definitely spent a lot of time thinking about things like evolution and phylogenetics, and so he certainly had some very interesting questions to ask about my thesis. And the external examiner for me was Dr. Daniel Sepka, who is one of the world's leading experts on fossil birds, especially fossil penguins. And so, of course, he was a very suitable external assessor for my Viva. And instead of like giving a presentation to them during the Viva, the examiners have essentially read through my thesis beforehand and already prepared what questions they are going to ask. And so during the Viva, I just kind of sat down with them and went through the thesis chapter by chapter and kind of discussed with them various subjects that they raised. And it wasn't like sort of, I mean, I kind of used this joke before, that the PhD vibe as sort of an interrogation where they ask you like, well, what you did wrong and stuff. But in practice, it didn't work out like quite like that. It really was more of a conversation. Like they had questions, but they weren't so much questions that were meant to nitpick at things that I did, but just things like, why did you do this study this way, or what do you think about this conclusion or these results, or how might you expect to take these methods or these findings to apply to future research, that kind of thing. And it was honestly a really pleasant discussion, I would say. I've certainly heard about, mostly secondhand. I haven't talked to that many other people who have been through the process, but I've certainly heard about nightmare vivas that people have had where things did not go so well. But I would say those are relatively rare. In general, people often give much the same advice to you before you start your viva, and I find that if your examiners are like fair people who are really interested in doing their job instead of trying to antagonize you, I would expect like the general experience to be similar. Essentially, that you know the specific topic of your thesis better than anyone, so really you don't have much to worry about. And furthermore, this is very likely to be the only time you'll get to be able to talk in such depth with people who are like honestly interested and have like seriously read very in great detail about your work. So yeah, no, I actually quite enjoyed the Viva. It went pretty well. It didn't take too long. It went for about 2 hours or so, which is pretty typical. And unlike in a U.S. Defense, you don't have like a whole audience like watching your every move or like picking up everything you say or anything like that. So it's just the examiners, and like not even your supervisor has to be there. They can if you request it, but if you want them for moral support or something, but they don't have to be there. So in my case, my supervisor, I did not ask him to attend. And I'll just kind of add as an aside here. So of course my main supervisor is Dr. Daniel Field, and so that means like almost everyone involved in my thesis is named Daniel. So that's kind of funny, yeah. So three Daniels kind of sort of overseeing my thesis, but yeah. In any case, once the viva is done, once the conversation is over, the examiners then kind of talk amongst themselves and decide what result to give you, the one who is being examined. And there can be several different outcomes. They might request major revisions, so they might want you to change major parts of your thesis before submitting again to the university before they consider it, up to standard. They might request some minor changes, which is pretty common, or they might request no changes at all. And I like by the time that the Viva started, like I had sort of come to terms with the fact that it probably wasn't going to be that bad. Like I wasn't expecting to fail or anything. That is super rare. If you've like worked for 4 years or more on your thesis and just like did everything you could to make it look reasonably good, then there usually isn't much reason to expect that you will fail. But what I didn't expect was that they did not request any changes at all. Yeah, that was so surprising and gratifying, I must say, because of course, like I said, Daniel Sepka is a expert in fossil birds, so I was fully expecting that he would find some sort of problem to pick. He's a nice guy. He's not going to like antagonize me over it, but I was fully expecting that he would notice something that I should change, but no, like they said no corrections needed, and so now all I have to do is basically wait to hear back from the university to say when I can submit like a sort of a final version of my thesis, which I don't have to change if I don't want to. I probably will make a few minor changes just because I personally have some issues, like you're your own worst critic, as they say, that I want to amend. But yeah, otherwise that should be relatively smooth sailing from here on out. Super grateful to my examiners and to my supervisors for being with me through this process, and it's been great. And since the Viva is essentially the equivalent, like the sort of final hurdle you pass before you are allowed to be awarded a PhD, that means it is now socially acceptable to refer to me as Dr. Albertonicus, which is still kind of surreal, to be honest. Like honestly, from a personal perspective, it doesn't feel like anything has really changed that much at all. But I mean, I'm allowed to have that title now, so that's cool. And obviously, that's probably my biggest news I have to share. For the past month since we last had an episode. Something else I'll mention is that one of my lab mates who started his PhD at the same time as I did, so that's Juan Benito, he also had his Viva almost 2 weeks after mine, I think. and he also passed with no corrections requested. And it's really exciting because we are the first two PhD graduates to come out of Daniel Field's lab. So yeah, it was definitely some really exciting occasions all around. And Han has done a lot of great work on looking at the anatomy and the evolution of dinosaurs that are very closely related to birds, like very similar to modern birds. Things like Ichthyornis from the late Cretaceous, which is, at a glance, pretty much identical to a modern bird, except for the fact that it has teeth. So, there's going to be some exciting work to come out of his PhD very soon. There's a lot of it still hasn't been published, but yeah, when it is, I think it's going to be very important for people who study these subjects. That's definitely the biggest and most prominent kind of news in my life recently. In the meantime, I've sort of been working on various other things. I've been invited to write a book chapter. I won't go into too much detail about what it's about, but it's basically going to be a review of a certain topic that I have published research on in the past. And I think it's a topic that hasn't really been reviewed in a lot of detail in previous works, so I'm quite excited to work on that. In fact, I'm almost done with it. In fact, since it's been a while since the last time we discussed our lives, I'm almost finished writing that, and so what I'll have to do is kind of wrap that up and send it off to my supervisor, who is one of the co-authors on this chapter, and we can talk to the other authors from there, and hopefully that will go smoothly in terms of kind of getting that chapter finished. I'm pretty excited for it. It's an interesting subject, and I'm fairly satisfied with what I've written so far. But yeah, I guess that really is probably the main things I have to report. How about you?
Oh, well, let me just say, like, congratulations on everything. It is so good to hear that everything went so smoothly for you and for your friend. Um, I know you even wrote you drew some art as well.
You're right. Yes. So to kind of celebrate Han and I passing both of our vivas, um, I drew a portrait of our lab. So all of the uh, all of the graduate students and postgraduate researchers in the lab, as well as our supervisor, of course, but with sort of a twist. So if you've known me for a while, you might know that I have done kind of similar portraits in the past. Um, a lot of the time, I haven't done this in a while because the last few conferences have all been not in person. And actually, speaking of which, I should mention that my Viva also took place via Zoom, and so that is also kind of abnormal, but it's actually a good thing in some ways. Because for one thing, Dan Sepka is in the U.S. So if it had been a normal Viva, he would have had to like arrange a whole trip to come over here and sit in on the Viva probably. But since we now have these protocols set up to do like digital Vivas during the pandemic, we decided that we'll just do a digital one. That seems like it's most practical. And plus, the pandemic is not really over, despite what certain governments might.
Right.
Lead one to believe. And so no, it's that was great. But in any case, what I was saying was the last few major kind of paleontological conferences have not been in person, and so it's been a while since I've done a drawing like this. But back when we had in-person conferences, I often used to basically draw like a scene of, say, myself or some of my friends or colleagues or instructors kind of hanging out at the conference. But instead of drawing us as people, which I suck at, I would draw everyone as some kind of, well, usually a prehistoric animal. But usually some kind of a non-human animal avatar, and I would try to pick like species that would be of some significance to them, like particular species that they might identify with or symbolize themselves as, which is kind of the case for myself. So of course I use an Alvarezor avatar, Alberta Nicus. Um, but a lot of the times, like with researchers, I kind of use a particular notable species that they have studied or that their research focuses on, or just something that they have a particular affinity for. And yeah, it's so I've drawn several images like that in the past, just depicting, you know, me and other people hanging out at conferences, and they tend to be pretty fun. I think most of the people that have been featured in those drawings tend to be quite amused and pleased by the depictions. But it's been a long time since I've drawn one. But I wanted to do one for the entire lab, and so yeah, I drew one with myself. So as Alberta Nicus. So instead of like using the actual bird species that I've studied, I still continue to use my Alvarezor avatar for this because I can't really imagine using anything else at this point. Um, for Juan, of course, I used Ichthyornis because that's the subject of his biggest thesis chapter that he's been working on for a very long time. And so the two of us in the drawing are wearing, you know, graduation caps to symbolize us passing our vivas, but everyone else in the lab is there with us in the drawing as well. And yeah, for everyone, I had to pick like, you know, certain species that symbolize them. Most of them are birds, or at least closely related to modern birds, and in many cases they are species that they focus on for their own research. But in a few cases, it's like I said, it's like species that they have expressed a particular liking for or favoritism for. So I tried to, like, you know, be very try to be very thoughtful and specific about my choices there. And our supervisor Daniel, I drew him uh, as a stem turrico. So there's a species of fossil bird from about 50 million years ago called Foro that was found in Western North America. It's known from a nearly complete skeleton, and it's been a sort of mystery bird for many decades. People have noticed like similarities to certain groups of modern birds, but no one has really wanted to commit to exactly what it is. And during his PhD, Daniel, in one of his thesis chapters, he tried to figure out what Foro was and ran some phylogenetic analyses to figure this out. And his conclusion was that it was most likely a stem turrico. And I know that Daniel has a particular affinity for turricos in general. Like in his office, for example, he has like a poster of all the turrico species on his wall. And so I was like, yeah, okay, so he can be a turrico, and specifically a fossil turrico. I imagine he would like that. He said in his words that the drawing was magnificent, so I think he did. And yeah, in general, I think most of my lab mates who have responded to the drawing have really liked it. So I'm pretty happy about that, and it's actually something I've been wanting to do for a while, just like giving everyone like kind of bird or stem bird avatars, which is yeah, something I do. If you share a lab with me, you get assigned a stem bird avatar or a bird avatar. It's non-negotiable. And so yeah, no, it was fun to make that drawing and to kind of show my appreciation for everyone in a way. I'm someone who, I don't know, I don't often express myself very much, I guess. Like I don't really, I don't often like tell people that they're great or things like that, even when I think they are. And I think that's just part of the introversion talking. But you know, I really do think like all my lab mates do really great work and are really good people. So I this was sort of a way for me to kind of express that in my own way, I guess. So yeah, no, that was fun to do, and I guess we can link the portrait in the description below, so everyone can check it out. It was fun, and maybe at some point I can elaborate on like why I chose like specific species for everyone, but I don't want to keep us here for too long. So yeah, no, it was fun. I imagine you got a kick out of it too, even if you don't know most of these people personally.
Oh, of course. I think it's very sweet. I mean, like I love your art style, and I think it's really cool that you've done portraits like this. I think it's a really cool idea. They're also like they're kind of like snapshots of good memories,
Yeah,
good times.
yeah.
You can keep track of everybody through your work. I think that's just fantastic. Um, yeah, not a whole lot to report on my end. I've mostly been dedicating my time to the website and
Mm.
to my further education. Just reading. Um, Over the course of the last few weeks, I read my first Friends to Wall book. I'm surprised it took me this long to do so.
Mm.
This one in particular was Mama's Last Hug, which some of you might remember I mentioned briefly in an update to one of the Humanity a Prologue episodes, regarding empathy in the great apes. And I had heard about this book, and I knew that it was an interesting read, and I wanted to check it out. And thankfully, my local library had it, which is always nice to read a new book that I don't have to buy
Hmm.
first,
Yeah.
just to make sure if it's like pretty good. Um, and Yeah, it definitely delivered. Franz de Waal is an incredible animal behavioralist, an ethologist, as it's called, um, and he's worked extensively with primates, and he brings a lot of his expertise to the table, and he argues very convincingly for emotions in many groups of non-human animals,
Mm.
including all the birds and mammals, and even including fish as well, and some invertebrates, just based on a number of criteria, recent developments in psychology and animal behavior and evolutionary biology. And it's a very richly rewarding book, and I can't recommend it enough. Very great stuff, and I'll definitely incorporate a lot of that into the show over time.
Mm. Mm.
So I definitely enjoyed that quite a bit. And yeah, other than that, I've been reading up on hominins. Keeping up with the news and trying to incorporate as best as I can into what we hope will become a really great website.
Mm. Mm.
So definitely looking forward to that. Um, as far as like pop culture stuff goes, there's a couple fun things to mention.
Mm.
I know that the next Marvel series had come out recently, Moon Knight.
Mm.
So I've been watching that. Of course, a lot of it has to do with ancient Egypt, which is always fun.
Mm. Mm.
Although it's at this point now in the MCU where like I don't know a lot of these characters they're introducing. I have like no prior
Yeah.
knowledge of them. It's not like Spider-Man, like, oh, everybody knows
Right,
Spider-Man. But
right.
like Moon Knight, it's like if you were to ask me before the show who Moon Knight was, I'd be like, I don't know. He's a knight who works for the moon, who's nocturnal. I don't know. But it's really cool. Oscar Isaac, great actor, plays the lead role. So I've been enjoying that. It's a 6 episode series, so only the first two have come out, and I've been enjoying it. Although I've been worried that it's kind of recycling some plots a bit. I don't know if this is the right place to bring it up. It might be a bit spoilery, but it's like I kind of feel like we've been doing these stuff before
Mm. Mm.
in earlier shows and films. But I suppose that's to be expected. I mean, it's been 10 years plus that we've been having the MCU, so there's
Right.
bound to be some overlap in plots. But I mean, for me, like the characters are my big draw, and so far, like they've been catching my attention more than anything else, and the setting as well is kind of neat. So that's been fun. But oh my gosh, so um, we were actually chatting, doing our usual, you know, show maintenance, discussing plans for Through Time and Clades,
Mm.
when a much anticipated trailer dropped
Mm. Mm.
for a series that we had heard about through the Twitter grapevine for a while now.
Mm. Mm.
Um, let's see, how do I describe this? So this is a brand new documentary series that's part of what you could call the Planet Earth franchise.
Right. Yeah.
BBC and Discovery Channel have been putting out a lot of landmark documentary series about natural history. So those of you might remember Blue Planet or Planet Earth or Human Planet or The Green Planet, which is a recent show. Albert, I know you've been catching up with it too. I definitely got to get on that myself. Um, and so coming soon, in fact, I think this is for next month. We have Prehistoric Planet. Now, this is a John Favreau production. So, of course, he was instrumental in kickstarting the MCU. He was the director of the Iron Man movies.
Hmm.
He's did a lot of work for Disney. Of course, he did the live action Jungle Book and The Lion King, one of which was a pretty good movie, and the other one wasn't. But that's a whole other topic. Um, but it's well known that Favreau is kind of a nerd. He's kind of a natural history nerd like us. He's fascinated by a lot of the subjects that we are.
Yeah.
So I think it's very fitting that he would use his influence to kickstart a paleontology documentary
Hmm.
in the style of the great Planet Earth franchise series that we've been treated to over the last few decades. Um, and so, what that basically means, at least from the impressions that we've been getting, is that we're going to have an almost naturalistic look at the last dinosaurs, or I guess the last non avian dinosaurs,
Hmm.
and their world in the late Cretaceous period. And so, of course, that includes a lot of fan favorites, T Rex, of course, among others. Um, but what it's going to do is showcase so much more than the dinosaurs themselves. We're going to be treated to the landscapes and many um, other reptile groups, invertebrate faunas, for example, um, and just from the trailer itself,
Hmm.
like the little teasers we get of how the animals look and how the landscape looks is really exciting. Um, One of the appeals of having John Favreau on this project is, of course, with the Jungle Book and the Lion King, he has been working with animation companies to create far more realistic CGI animals
Hmm.
than we're used to. And say what you want about the Lion King, and there's certainly a lot to say. One of the big appeals is that the animals look really good.
Yeah.
Like they're very naturalistic, they're very detailed. Um, Quite a couple of the behaviors are just on point in parts of the film. And so, what better way to extend that to extinct animals than to do a series like this? And so, yeah, the trailer dropped, and it was kind of a weird thing too.
Hmm.
So it was April Fool's Day
Right.
when
Yeah.
the trailer dropped. So at first you're like, well, whoa, wait a minute, right? Because um, yeah, April Fools is kind of notorious among natural history folks like
Hmm.
us, especially following a long tradition of people with blogs making April Fools posts.
Including myself.
Yeah, yeah, and like some of them are very clearly
Right.
meant to be jokes,
Yeah.
but others like hinge on plausibility to a point where like gullible people will refer back to them
Yeah.
like after the fact as
Right.
like actual scientific work,
Yeah.
which is like oops, and like in the age of misinformation,
Hmm.
um the way that it is nowadays, there's been definitely a pushback against that sort of stuff.
Right.
And so like sort of like the best advice that has been given regarding this is like if you really want to do an April Fool's post, you got to make it as completely bonkers as possible,
Right.
to the best of your ability, because you know then again, people can get fooled by really bonkers stuff as well.
Yeah.
Um, that's why the Onion is so funny.
Hmm.
But yeah, but otherwise, like it's best to just not do it at all. And so, of course, for us, like when this trailer dropped, we're like, oh, okay, so somebody made a really clever fake. But like, it became like immediately apparent that no, this is legit. Um, so we get this really lovely trailer with music by Hans Zimmer, who is going to do the soundtrack
Hmm.
for this documentary. And of course, we're given really nice narration by none other than the great David Attenborough, who is also going to be our narrator for this series. Again, in the vein of the Planet Earth franchise, because he pretty much narrated all of these series, at least in the UK. Of course, when in the earlier years, like when they would get transferred to America, they would pick a different narrator to voice over them, which has received very mixed results.
Right.
So, for example, when Planet Earth came to the U.S., um, they had Sigourney Weaver to narrate it. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, she's very big into conservation, which is kind of cool. Similarly, when Life came to America, they got Oprah Winfrey,
Mm-hmm.
big influencer. But I think nowadays, like people have expressed their preference for David Attenborough. I
Right.
mean, he's such a distinct, personality in natural history filmmaking that
Mm-hmm.
to even suggest that we should probably replace his narration is almost blasphemy to some folks.
Yeah.
So lately they've been keeping his narration, and so thankfully we have him here for Prehistoric Planet, and it seems like it's gonna stick to the Planet Earth formula and keep it completely naturalistic. You're staying with these animals in their environment for the whole series, so it's not going to be like other paleo documentaries where you might have some life restorations, maybe some animation here and there, but it's mostly talking heads and footage from the field and various aspects of that. No, this is going to be completely played straight. It's like people went back in time to film dinosaurs and other fossil animals in their environment. Which, if you grew up with Walking with Dinosaurs, um, you know what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of nice. Like this is almost a spiritual successor to Walking with
Oh yeah.
Dinosaurs. In fact, we noticed some callbacks in the trailer, which is like, wow, that kind of pulls you back to your childhood,
Mm-hmm.
because like, oh my gosh, Walking with Dinosaurs was everything to me growing up. I mean, I had cousins who had the VHSs, and then my folks bought me the DVDs, and I used to watch them all the time. Like I was so engrossed in that series because like that was like the best dinosaur documentary at the time that I had at my disposal.
Yeah.
Alongside, I would say, When Dinosaurs Roamed America, and then Dinosaur Planet too, which is
Mm-hmm.
that's a fun one. Um, yeah, so the thing about this series, though, so this is not getting a televised premiere
Mm-hmm.
like most of the Planet Earth franchise has gotten. Um, Much like I think Green Planet is the same way as well. Um, this is getting put on the streaming service, and so Prehistoric Planet is going to be available on Apple TV Plus. And now, what that means is you don't have to necessarily buy an Apple TV
Right.
or have an Apple TV to get this service. I think it's like $5 a month, and there's like a week long free trial,
Mm-hmm.
and it works on any TV that is a smart TV. So like if you have a Roku like we do, you should be able to get it. So it's relatively like easy to access, um, and so that'll start on the 23rd of May, and it's going to be a 5 day event. So unlike a lot of streaming services, they're not going to dump it all at once. They're going to keep it one per night, and so eventually you'll have the whole series
Mm-hmm.
at your disposal. And we at the moment that's really all the information we have. We don't know what the length of the episodes are. So if they're going to be like other series in the Planet Earth franchise, they're going to be like an hour each. Um, that would be cool. I know typically paleo docs stick with a half hour just to factor in animation budgets,
Mm-hmm.
but then again, this is John Favreau and colleagues, so they probably put a whole lot of money in this to afford hour long episodes. Which, oh my gosh, can you imagine 5 hours of like natural history paleo documentary content?
Oh gosh.
Like, wow, that would be great.
Yeah.
Um, and like, we're definitely promised a huge range of animals
Yeah.
that we get to enjoy, and plants too, apparently.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the trailer only gives a small sample, and already there's some really neat things that we see. So we have like sauropods with inflatable neck structures.
Mm-hmm.
Has been proposed on a number of occasions. Dinosaurs in the snow, very iconic.
Yep.
Um, we have parental behaviors. Uh, a giant as dark as pterosaurs, which is always fun. feathered dinosaurs that
Yeah.
are like plausibly feathered.
Yeah, and actually look good. Yeah.
Yeah. Like there's one shot in the trailer. I guess it's supposed to be Velociraptor.
Yeah, it's either that or something similar, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, because if it's so, the initial impressions that I guess we've been told is that this is about the Maastrichtian
Hmm.
epoch. So like the last few million years of the Cretaceous. But if they're showing Velociraptor,
Right.
well then that extends that time scale quite a bit because
Hmm.
Velociraptor is nowhere near the Maastrichtian.
Yeah, it
Um,
was it was from the epoch right before the Campanian.
yeah, yeah. Um, but hey, who knows?
Yep.
Maybe they did that for ease of convenience because
Right,
I
right.
know there's not a lot of really like well known like fully complete Maastrichtian ecosystems that you can pull from.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, Besides Hell Creek, of course. But then everybody's done Hell Creek. I
Yeah,
mean,
right.
there's a video game about Hell Creek, so you
Yeah,
can
right.
you can get a good sample of it there. Um, but like apparently we're going to be treated to a lot of really cool animals,
Hmm.
and I think the one of the most exciting things that has kept my hopes up for this
Yeah.
because like there is like an aspect of this where there's been so many dinosaur documentaries in recent years, and they've all either been hits or misses,
Yeah.
and the majority on the latter side.
Hmm.
You know, like because there's all kinds of compromises that have to be made depending on
Right,
who
right.
gets to work on the documentary and like what animals are shown and the quality of the research that is shown, um, and also like how well consultants are listened to.
Yeah, right.
Um, but suffice to say, there doesn't seem to be any indication that that is the case with this. So the amount of people who've been coming forward saying, "Hey, we're working on, we worked on Prehistoric Planet,"
Hmm.
is just amazing. And they're all people that we know very well and who do really quality work
Yeah.
and they care deeply about the science and getting it right.
Hmm.
Um, so like our friend Darren Naish, we can
Yep.
take a drink. Um,
Yeah.
in fact, I think he was like one of the main consultants,
Yep.
and he put that out there for all of us to see. Um, Gabrielle Guito, Mark Witten. Um, Let me think. I think Scott Hartman
Yes, I think
is
so.
in this
Yeah.
as well. There's a lot of beautiful skeletal reconstructions.
But people have been calling this like sort of like the Avengers Assemble of paleo documentaries, and I mean it kind of is, yeah.
Yeah, which I mean is great for the rest of us because, um, yeah, it seems like a lot of care was put into this
Hmm.
in getting it right, and so maybe finally, we have like a paleo documentary that we've all been kind of waiting for,
Right, right.
and it feels good. And I'm just super excited to see this come to fruition,
Hmm.
um, because we already have a trailer and we have a small clip,
Yep.
and like that small clip in particular, um, has been blowing up because probably more so than the trailer.
Right.
Because the weird thing about the trailer was, so I brought up April Fool's Day. Hans Zimmer was the very first to drop this thing,
Yes.
and it was online for like what 5 minutes, and then that post was just deleted,
Yeah, yeah.
and everyone's like, what the hell? What was that? So maybe he may have been like he may have prematurely dropped the trailer.
Right.
But of course, that doesn't really mean anything because people immediately ripped to that trailer and shared it on their own platforms. So it got out there.
Yeah.
Um, and then, like I think, like a day later or two, then all the appropriate people came forward and were like, "Oh yeah, by the way, this is a thing."
Yeah.
And so then it came out there. But like, yeah, one of the main things that was released as well was a small clip showing baby T Rexes on a shore, and they're kind of playing with some sea turtles that may or may not be CG. That's a whole thing. Um, but then like it pans to show the adult male Tyrannosaurus, and oh my gosh, they look great. Like they look so realistic. That's like the big thing for me.
Hmm.
Like a lot of paleo documentaries have not aged well, only in the sense that their CGI has
Right, right.
clearly been surpassed. I mean, to watch Walking with Dinosaurs now, it was an accomplishment at the time, but oh my gosh, there's a whole lot there in regards to technicalities. But then you look at this and some of these shots, especially like the close-ups of the baby T Rex. It's like, wow, that looks like an animal that I could like pet in real life. It does not look CG.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's integrated with the environment really well. The movements are naturalistic. It just looks great, and they're fluffy too, which is a
Yeah.
plus. So yeah, Prehistoric Planet by Jon Favreau and David Attenborough and Hans Zimmer and a whole crew of really great paleo folks. Um, we will almost certainly talk about it. Um, in what way, we're still kind of debating ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
but we'll definitely put our thoughts out there as we've been doing. But I think between this and the Dinosauria series,
Yeah.
among other projects, there's been some great paleo content out there, and I
Mm-hmm.
think I will probably agree with some other folks that we're probably entering a new golden age of dinosaur docs,
Mm-hmm.
which I am all here for.
Yeah. Mm.
So yeah, definitely. We're excited for that. Albert, any kind of final additional thoughts on the show?
Yeah, sure. I'm definitely excited. Like from the trailer, like I would say like all the animals look really good. Like not just in terms of realism, but scientific plausibility as well. And yeah, like this is something that I would say like the paleo community has been really hungry for because it's not just that we haven't had a good like dinosaur documentary in ages or paleo documentary at least, but well, I should qualify that. I should say that we haven't really had a good paleo documentary in this specific style, where it's like a mock natural history documentary where they're going out and quote unquote filming the animals quote unquote in the wild, that kind of style. There have been some documentaries where it's like talking to paleontologists and them showing fossils and things, and those are pretty great. But I think like a lot of people have very fond memories of series like Walking with Dinosaurs that do like the pseudo documentary style kind of natural history format, and that's something that we haven't gotten in oh gosh like over a decade probably,
Mm.
and and even then some people would argue that we haven't had a good one of those for not since Walking with Dinosaurs in some cases. Some might say. I would say like a few of the ones in between are pretty decent. Personally, or at least I think so.
Mm.
But I think a lot of people would say that few, if any, have like really captured what made the original Walking with Dinosaurs engaging. Um, and it does really seem like that this documentary is very likely to do that. And again, portraying all this very up to date and I guess you could say progressive science. It's amazing. Like I personally, I would say like this is the first time I've been excited for a piece of like for like a paleo TV show in a long time. Like, yeah, I probably haven't been like truly excited for one since like maybe some of the series that came out around like 2011 or so. And back then, like I hadn't even started college yet. Like, so that was a pretty different person back then. I
Mm.
think nowadays I might have become more a bit more cynical about the quality of these shows, but I can say like more or less unreservedly that this really does look amazing. And again, it really seems like everyone involved in this uh, is really committed to like paying due respect to the science and getting the science right and making everything look great and producing really high quality work. And yeah, I am very much looking forward to it. um, I believe this series has been foreshadowed for a little while. I think the first public reports that this series was going to be made um, came out in 2019 or so. Uh, but we didn't know really, we didn't really have much of any more public info besides that since then. Now, I have gotten very tiny glimpses of some of the stuff because for a while, I think back in 2019, I hung out somewhat regularly with Darren Naish, who is again one of the lead consultants of the show, and he did give me a tiny bit of information about the stuff he was working on, but only a tiny bit. Like I do not have like any substantial insider info on this at all. He just basically mentioned that he was working on it, um, and so yeah. So I've had high hopes for it for a while, but we've just kind of been knowing that this was coming, but not really getting any new information. Then boom, they suddenly drop all this trailer and teaser footage on it. So it's like, whoa, yeah, this really does live up to expectations. This is really really good. So I'm sure we'll have a lot of thoughts once it's actually out, and I'm very excited to see it. Let me think. What else was I going to say? Oh, right. So I have heard from people who work on documentaries that there are, in fact, other series in the works that purportedly probably have a similar theme or similar format, or at least ideas to the show, where it's like paleo documentaries showing the animals in their natural environment. And so this is, you're probably right that we're about to enter like a new age of these documentaries after a long drought. There's probably going to be many more to come, and I guess as for how those ones will turn out, we'll see. But yeah, it really does seem like something is really really building up here, and for most of those other series that have been alluded to, as far as I know, there has not really been any kind of public information released about them yet. So I guess, yeah, we'll probably have to wait a bit longer to hear more about those. But yeah, there is more stuff in the works, and I am definitely awaiting, anticipating like what this new age will bring, and certainly Prehistoric Planet, being the first one out of the gate is a very very strong start, to say the least. So yeah, super excited. I'm sure we'll say more when the time comes.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely between like the major network kind of projects like this and then more personal online projects. Forgotten Bloodlines comes to
Oh
mind,
yes.
which is about Miocene mammals in North America. That one looked really exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to be in for some fun stuff. Can't wait. But I think we've shared our world long enough. I think it's time to
Yeah.
kind of focus more on the wider natural world. Albert, you want to go ahead and drop your first story on us?
Sounds good. Yeah, let's get started. So, as usual, we have four different news stories to tell you about in our news episode this month. So, my first story is about bird migration, particularly one species of bird called the Caspian tern, and this story has to do with essentially how these birds learn their migratory routes. So, bird migration is one of those subjects that has fascinated people for a long time. In fact, it took a while for people to even realize that long distance migrations in birds were a thing, that they could like travel, make these intercontinental journeys every year. We still have a lot of questions about how bird migration works, and one of these is, how do birds learn where to go in the first place? And to some extent, it is probably there is probably like an innate factor to it, and birds automatically know, okay, it's about time, it's time to fly south. But there are a lot of details that go into that journey, like exactly what route do you take, and where do you stop on to refuel? How do birds pick up this information? And we do know that in a lot of social migratory birds, there is an important learning component to migration. You might have seen cases where people have reared, say, geese or cranes from, when they're young as chicks, and then they have to teach those kind of human-reared birds to migrate, or at least teach them the route that they have to take to migrate. And people have kind of had to get in their ultralight planes and actually fly with the birds and show them the way to migrations. You might have seen footage of this if you watched documentaries about conservation of these types of birds. And yeah, it's quite interesting, but obviously that's not typically what happens in the wild. Usually these birds are not learning from humans in planes where to go. So yeah, what's the deal there? And of course, there are some migratory birds that are not social, and presumably, like for Tilim, like there's a bigger innate factor to migration. But others seem to do a lot more social learning, and we don't know much about that. Like, which birds do they learn from if they're using social learning? Like, do they learn from their parents? Do they learn from unrelated adults? They just like join a big flock with everybody else and learn that way. And if they learn from their parents, do they learn from their mother or from their father or both? Like, yeah, we have very little understanding of that kind of thing for most migratory birds. So this study decided to look at this subject for a particular species of migratory bird called the Caspian tern, and these are like really magnificent birds, I have to say. So they are the largest species of tern in the world. Their wingspan is like over a meter wide, some close to a meter and a half, in fact. So they're about the size of like a medium-sized gull, which is a lot bigger than most other types of terns, which yeah are tend to be much smaller and daintier than gulls are. And Caspian terns can be found almost on every continent of the world. I think they're only not found in Antarctica. And like that doesn't mean like their distribution covers like the entirety of all the other continents, but like they can be found in at least regions of all the other continents, which is pretty interesting. And they are migratory, so they usually breed in the north and then fly south for the winter. And in fact, I had the good fortune of seeing Caspian terns a couple of times when I was studying for my undergraduate degree in Maryland. So near our university campus, there was this big lake where there were often a lot of different water birds gathered around. And every now and then, when I had time, I would often walk over to the lake and do some bird watching. And in the springtime, there were a couple of occasions where I saw Caspian terns, and these were Caspian terns probably on their way north. Back to their breeding grounds for migration. So Caspian terns in North America, at least in the eastern part of North America, tend to breed up in Canada, but of course they pass through like a lot of the United States in the middle. And so, yeah, during the springtime, I would every now and then I would see like a Caspian tern like hanging around at the lake, and I would see them like flying over the lake and occasionally even plunging down to try and catch a fish from the sky. And yeah, that was a quite a spectacular sight. Again, they are quite large birds, and furthermore, they are very graceful birds. I mean, terns in general are like I would imagine like most people are probably more familiar with gulls than with terns, and gulls are spectacular flyers, but terns are terns kind of fly in a way that really defies gravity. I think when you watch them, like it really feels like they're just like floating on the air. Like that's just where they live, basically. Um, and they are very graceful. When I see terns, I kind of think of the idiom like float like a butterfly and sting like a bee, because yeah, they kind of seem to float effortlessly on their wings. So that certainly covers the butterfly bit. And with the bee part, well, I mean, they're certainly very precise hunters. Like the way they catch fish is usually by plunging down from the sky and then grabbing them from the water and then coming right back up again. Um, but not only that, but a lot of terns are actually very protective of their nests, and they have very sharp beaks. So, yeah, I know that a lot of researchers who study like breeding terns when they walk onto tern breeding grounds, like uh, they have a lot of stories to tell about how that they've been smacked in the head by terns, and you know even with these attacks even drawing blood in a lot of cases. And like Arctic terns that breed up in the Arctic, as their name suggests, they can drive off polar bears from their nests. So it's like, yeah, they're they're not heavyweights, but they're pretty impressive. So yeah, I definitely wouldn't want to be on like the wrong end of one. Uh, and yeah, they are really spectacular species. Now the researchers who authored this study, they were studying Caspian terns not in North America, but in Europe and in Africa. So what they did was they attached GPS devices to several different family groups of Caspian terns, so like the breeding pair and their young. And I think they looked at 8 different families of Caspian terns. And these Caspian terns were breeding in northern Europe, but they would fly south to winter in Africa. And so they decided with these GPS devices, they decided to track like the route and the timing of each of these different individual terns on their journeys. And that's kind of interesting because I believe in last month's news episode we talked about how GPS tracking devices have kind of given us a lot of information about animal movements, and this right here is an example of that. That they use GPS devices to study the movements of these Caspian terns, and so they found a lot of interesting patterns in terms of like how these Caspian terns migrate and who they migrate with. So first of all is that breeding pairs did not migrate together. So the male and the female had mated. They would take care of their young together on the breeding grounds, but when it was time to migrate, they would kind of go their separate ways and migrate at different times and sometimes using different routes. So that's pretty interesting. So they don't stick together for the wintering season. And then something else that was particularly interesting was sort of the punchline of this study was that young Caspian terns, the juveniles that had never migrated before in their life, they almost always accompanied their dad when they migrated. So because their parents, they would set off at different times, the young Caspian terns almost always stuck with their male parent instead of their female parent. There was one exception where they recorded a young Caspian tern kind of accompanying its mother, but all of the other examples that they observed, the Caspian terns accompanied their male parent on their journey. Now, in one case, which was quite interesting, and I would be very curious if there's more information about this, the young Caspian tern actually accompanied not its biological father, but an unrelated male adult. And yeah, I'm not sure what the deal is there, because that young tern had a sibling who took a different route, and so it was probably and it was not following its mother, so probably it was following its biological father. So yeah, I don't know why the other one did not also do that and instead went with an unrelated male. And as far as I know, Caspian terns are not known to practice like cooperative breeding, where like other adults besides a breeding pair help take care of the young. So I'm really curious about that situation. And the paper doesn't really elaborate on that point. It's possible that the researchers themselves didn't really have much information about what was happening there. But I'm curious. Like, was that unrelated male like an individual that the juvenile was already familiar with, and like, or was it like a second mate that the female had mated with? Was it like, was it an adult that had lost its mate and just wanted to take like a juvenile under its wing as kind of a expression of like parental instinct? I do not know. And I would be very curious to know if any further details are available about this. But in any case, the young Caspian terns almost always followed male parents or foster male parents during their migration. And once they only separated from the parent that they had followed after reaching the wintering grounds. And even then, it took quite some time before this happened, as the young gradually grew independent. I think on average, it took over 60 days for the young to like completely separate from the parent that they had migrated with on the wintering grounds. And so, they stuck together even after reaching their wintering grounds for 2 months, more or less. And this was true even for like the one that had followed the unrelated foster parent. And so evidently the young terns still kind of stay under the watch of their parents for a while after their first migration. And it seems that learning from these adult birds was very important to young Caspian terns because, well, first of all the instances where these researchers had observed young that had lost contact with their parent did not survive their migration. In most cases, it was because they got picked off by predators. But yeah, they probably were disoriented and didn't know where to go, and yeah, just didn't make it. And what's more is that adult Caspian terns have very high, what we say, fidelity to their migratory routes. So once they, learn the migratory route, they just keep reusing the same one over and over again from year to year, and and even the same kind of stopover sites as well, where they stop to get their energy reserves up. Um, and so evidently, like this first journey where they're migrating with their parent and usually their father, um, is very important to their annual cycles and learning to be a Caspian tern. Now, something that we still don't know from this study is why most of the young birds follow their male parent instead of their female parent. Yeah, that is not obvious. That will require further research to understand why that's the case. But it's a really interesting pattern. I know that like as mammals, I think we tend to think of like the mother, the female parent, as being more kind of parental, I guess, a lot of the time. And it is true that in many mammals, rearing the young is solely kind of the responsibility of the female. But that is not true for birds. Like a lot of birds, yeah, there are some birds where only the female takes care of the young, but like in many species of birds, it's either both parents taking care of the young, or in some cases even only the male parent taking care of the young. And so they have a lot more variation probably in the kind of patterns of parental care compared to mammals. And there's probably a very good reason for that, namely that young mammals have a very unusual way of feeding, don't they? And that's a type of feeding that can only be performed by the female parent, and that's because a newborn mammal feeds on its mother's milk. And so, yeah, a male, an adult male mammal cannot feed its young in that manner, and so it is less likely to be kind of selected for, I guess, by natural selection, where the male has participation in the parental care. Even though, of course, there are exceptions to that. There are certainly male mammals that partake in parental care, and I think our species is certainly very fortunate in being a very cooperative species, that where there can be not only the male parent potentially, but also possibly other adult family members taking care of the young as well. But in birds, of course, a male bird can feed its young in most cases just as well as a female bird can, and it can also help incubate the eggs. It can help keep the nest warm and clean. It can help defend the young from predators. Like all these parental duties can be shared between the male and the female parent, and so you get a lot more of this biparental care happening in birds. So that is kind of a very interesting pattern, and we're seeing that sort of that expressed here as well. I guess one final thing I'll mention about this is that the picture I chose here, I chose this picture because it's a very good photo, I think, of Caspian terns in flight. Um, and it really shows off like how wide that wingspan is. However, I don't think that this is a photo of like a juvenile accompanying its parent on migration or anything like that. From the coloration, I think both of these are breeding adults, and one probably just looks a lot smaller than the other due to perspective. So this is not an example of like the behavior that is being shown that was being discussed in this article. But I picked it because it shows what a Caspian tern looks like and what they look like in flight, especially. But yeah, these both of these seem to be like adults in breeding season. But yeah, fascinating behavior, and it's certainly a very interesting species to do it on, because I don't think like a lot of work has been done on like looking at Caspian tern migration, and this is a species that is found like almost all over the world. So certainly understanding how they migrate can be very illuminating and very interesting. So yeah, no, I thought that was a quite an interesting study. What do you think?
Yeah, I thought so as well. Like, it's kind of neat to have this like behavior properly documented,
Mm-hmm.
but in a way, like it does make a lot of sense for it to be this way. Young that have never gone on these migratory routes before, just kind of keeping up with their parents and then forming a mental map in their heads of this route.
Mm-hmm.
So that way, in successive migrations, they can just kind of pick it up instinctually and just go to and fro. Um, that's really neat to learn. Is this really the only example that we have documented so far of like juveniles staying with one parent and learning their migration routes that way?
That is a good question too. Off the top of my head, yeah, I'm not sure if there are any other documented examples where it's like this specific kind of learning where yeah, sticking like specifically with one parent, preferentially of one like specific sex as well. But yeah, off the top of my head, I don't recall any other examples. But like I'm sure that in many cases, just because this hasn't been studied for many species, and probably we will find more if we look for them. Yeah.
Gotcha, gotcha. Well, that's actually a really good segue into my first story. If we can shift gears here to the next slide,
Yep.
regarding an interesting behavior in birds.
Yep.
Now, it's funny I can actually say this. It's been over a year and a half since we started this show, and we finally have a news story where I get to talk about killdeers.
Right. Yeah.
Or I should say more specifically, we get to talk about a behavior that killdeers use
Right.
that is shared with other shorebirds and may be more common than we originally thought. So, back at my old house, we used to have killdeers nest in our yard frequently. So every year would be treated to the sight of little spotted eggs and cute puffball babies running around and peeping up the storm. The thing about killdeers is they nest in open spaces. Now, for shorebirds, they sure enjoy parking lots and public parks and residential neighborhoods more often. And they don't really build nests in the way that, say, songbirds do. They don't gather a bunch of sticks and materials together to like make a nest. They kind of make sort of like a depression in the ground, and like occasionally they may line it with grass or pebbles or small sticks. But the key, of course, is that the nest is very cryptic, as are the eggs. Killdeers prefer to find areas with enough ground cover to disguise the nest and eggs. And of course, the eggs themselves are spotted in a way that almost kind of blends in if you're not paying attention. And the babies themselves are also kind of cryptic too in their coloring, and they can hide, very well provided they're quiet. But of course, there's always slip ups, and predators may end up honing in on a nest on occasion. And this is where things get interesting. So the parent bird will see this and then actually call attention to the predator. The killdeer will hold one of its wings away from itself in kind of a weird angle, as if it was broken, and then make itself known, peeping and kind of running around and calling to the predator. And you can see the photo here on this slide. Kind of shows what this looks like, and hopefully that will distract the predator long enough for it to follow that bird far from the nest. After which the bird quits faking its injury and flies off, leaving a confused predator as far away from the nest as is appropriate. And this is known as the broken wing display, and it has been recorded in ornithological literature for the last few centuries. As I stated previously, it's not unique to killdeers, but it can be found among many shorebird groups. Think about snipes or stilts, gulls, and other plovers. But it seems that this deceptive behavior has also been recorded in more distantly related bird clades too. And this posed a number of questions for Lina de Framont and colleagues. So to kind of quote here, is the behavior predominantly found in shorebirds, as colloquial knowledge would suggest, or is it more widespread? Are there particular ecological contexts or life histories that are associated with this display? And so ultimately, these are questions about how the broken wing display evolved, and if this is something that was convergently evolved in different bird clades. And if that's the case, what does that say about the selection pressures that would lead to its emergence as a behavior? So, to provide some answers, the team scoured the literature, including the extensive Handbook of Birds of the World by Lynx Editions, for any mention of broken wing displays. And if there were issues in interpretation, they actually took the time to consult several ornithologists and museums and birding mailing lists, and even put out an advertisement at an international conference to just get as much info as they could. And it succeeded very well because all in all, Framon colleagues recorded 285 species of birds performing some form of the broken wing display. And this was spread out among 52 clades, what they call in the paper families, of course. Um, so, to retrieve important ecological and life history context that they can use as well, they also matched each species with a related sister taxa that was known not to engage in the broken wing display. And all of this was then plugged into a large scale phylogeny. And I think specifically they used the Jets et al. Study from 2012 as their framework. And then additional information on aspects of bird behavior were taken from BirdLife International, the IUCN Red List, and the Birds of the World in order to help test out different hypotheses that have been proposed to explain the origins of the broken wing display in prior literature. And specifically, they use this in statistical analyses to determine the probability of certain factors in causing a bird to use this display versus others. And so, out of all of this, they were able to find that the broken wing display was indeed present within almost all of the major bird lineages, with the exceptions of the Turacos, the clade Eucavitaves, so that's trogons, woodpeckers, rollers, and friends, and Aquornithes, so the big water bird group that includes all the seabirds and wading birds that we're familiar with. And it was indeed widespread among the shorebirds or charadriforms, occurring within 10 of 17 subclades, and was actually pretty well known among many passerine groups too, which is kind of interesting. And what was curious to me was, and to the authors as well, was the presence among the most ancient bird groups. So tinamous and both ducks and pheasants among Galloanseridae perform this behavior. And so like that did kind of have me wondering, like, well, were there more closely related stem bird groups that were using this too? Albert, do you think Asteriornis might have used something like this?
That's a great question. I mean, potentially, yeah. If it's found in both groups of modern Galloanserians, then I would guess that probably Asteriornis had fairly similar general reproductive behaviors to the crown group of Galloanseri, that is. So yeah, it's possible, and I definitely think that this study certainly has some implications for those of us who like paleontology to think about, like, so what types of extinct birds or bird relatives might have practiced this behavior. Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and yeah, either way, the best evidence available from this study, did suggest that the broken wing display evolved convergently multiple times in crown bird evolution and perhaps stem bird evolution as well. So Framon and colleagues chose 16 predictors to test to see if there were any correlations with the use of the broken wing display. And out of these, they were able to single out half of them. So there wasn't a match with body mass or with colonial nesting. In fact, the birds with altricial young, so those that are underdeveloped upon hatching, and they kind of look like these pink wiggly things, those species are more likely to use the broken wing display than birds with precocial young. That is, those that are more developed and can walk around the nest soon after hatching. And that's kind of interesting because shorebirds tend to have precocial
Yeah.
young.
Right.
They are well known to engage in this behavior
Yeah.
too. But the numbers favored more the altricials when they ran the numbers. So those predictors related to predation risk, perhaps unsurprisingly, tended to show connections with the broken wing display. So things like short incubation duration, low nest cover, uh, as well as the type of habitat and the latitude. Those were all very important connections with the broken wing display. Now, there was a weak effect favoring more species using this behavior in temperate and polar regions
Hmm.
than tropical ones. But overall, it didn't really make as much of a difference as that between open versus closed areas.
Hmm.
So, like grasslands versus forests, of which broken wing behaviors were more likely in the latter. Now, the lack of observations among the Eucavitaves in particular, with their habit of using nest cavities,
Hmm.
high in the trees, suggests that breeding ecology and the broken wing display are strongly associated with each other. I mean, why bother trying to lure predators away from your nest when that nest is near impossible to reach anyway?
Hmm.
It's kind of hidden. I mean, just think about hornbills, for
Yeah.
example. You're essentially looking for a hole in a tree that may or may not have babies in it.
Right.
um, so the effect of latitude turned out to have the absolute strongest effect
Hmm.
on whether a bird used this behavior or not. If a bird lives at higher latitudes, so further north or further south from the equator, and it builds a nest that's relatively exposed to house precocial chicks, or even just a single chick, then they are far more likely to use the broken wing display as a defense behavior against ground dwelling predators. The selection pressures that predators put on such birds seems to be a factor in explaining their diverse evolution across multiple bird lineages. And given that latitude affects how said predators behave, the chance of the broken wing display evolving would increase in the aforementioned circumstances. For example, according to the authors, the ecological behavior of predators changes from mostly nocturnal in tropical regions to mostly diurnal in temperate zones,
Hmm.
thus providing more opportunities for predators to spot ground dwelling bird nests out in the open in evergreen and deciduous forests that are typical for, say, Eurasia and North America. And similarly, the breeding season for birds seems to change likewise. In the tropics, where the breeding season is long, parent birds may abandon their nests under predation pressures in the hopes that there will be, better breeding at a future date. While in the temperate regions, the breeding season is shorter, and so parent birds will put up more of a fight to defend their nests.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so, in this analysis, short breeding season was one of the predictors that encouraged the evolution of broken wing displays. And so, such birds are closely related to species that engage in mobbing.
Hmm.
So, if you ever see a group of grackles pestering a hawk that's kind of floating into their little area. That's an example of this. They will fly towards this larger bird and just kind of mess with it, pick at its feathers and stuff, and try to drive it away.
Yep. Hmm.
And it's implied that there's a possible link between these two behaviors. So, like mobbing could evolve into a sort of broken wing display, or vice versa.
Hmm. Hmm.
So ultimately, the broken wing display is an extraordinary example of parental care that is apparently so effective at deterring predators that it evolved at least 52 times.
Yeah. Wow.
Um, but there are still questions out there. You know, the study did not test whether cryptic patterning of eggs and offspring are a factor in the
Hmm.
evolution of this behavior, or if the widespread sample of recorded instances is even complete enough.
Hmm.
It may be that there's many more species out there performing the broken wing display than we know.
Yep.
You
Hmm.
know, all it may take to discover them is a birder being in the right place at the right time,
Hmm. Hmm.
which obviously doesn't mean go to every single nest and like
Oh
just
yeah.
mess with the eggs. There's far easier and more ethical ways to observe this behavior
Right.
than being a predator yourself.
Yeah. Right.
But I thought this was a very fascinating paper, and again, it really hit close to home because I have observed the broken wing display on a number of
Yeah.
occasions. Of course, having a lawn like we did that was very big, we had to mow it all the time.
Right.
And when the birds would nest in our yard, thankfully they did not nest in the open.
Hmm.
They stayed near our bushes and in the gravelly areas. So, and we were always self-conscious about them too. So we would always give them kind of a wide berth.
Hmm.
But even still, like when it came to like lawn maintenance, checking the trees, root planting, soil, that sort of thing, occasionally we would happen upon a nest and like we would avoid it, but then there's the mom or dad in the background, holding out the wing and doing the thing.
Yeah.
Like, hey, follow me instead. Um, so like I was very familiar with this,
Hmm.
and kind of reading through all the different factors that may have led to its evolution, it does make quite a lot of sense to kind of see it in that light.
Yeah.
Um, of course, more evidence for sure is needed and would certainly help make the case. But I think this is a really good start.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, Albert?
Yeah, I would agree with that. It seems like they did a very thorough job of examining this behavior, and it is a really fascinating behavior that people have been interested in for a long time and have noticed for a long time. Um, it's a it's quite remarkable how many times it has evolved. Especially, I think, uh, because this kind of like feigning injury, as we would say, as a distraction display, I don't think it occurs in many other groups of animals, and yet it has evolved so many times in birds. And I think there's a pretty obvious reason for that, and that's the fact that birds have a very easy way of escaping from most other predators, right? So yeah, they're very suited to doing this. They can just pretend that they're an easy target, and then just take off once the threat has been neutralized. So it's a it's definitely really interesting that uh, that kind of adaptation has opened up this behavior to them, and then so many lineages have been able to take advantage of it. Um, yeah, and kind of circling back to like whether or not this might have occurred in certain fossil species, I would guess like based on the factors that the authors have identified here that are correlated with the broken wing display, I would suspect that it was probably less common in Mesozoic dinosaurs than in modern birds. For one thing, as far as we know, uh, the majority of Mesozoic dinosaurs, even or especially if you consider the ones that are able to fly, if we consider that as sort of prerequisite for this behavior. From what we've found in the fossil record, it seems that a lot of the groups that were closely related to modern birds uh, were very precocial. In some cases, like not just even able to walk shortly after hatching, but perhaps even able to fly very shortly after hatching, and so probably did not receive a lot of parental care after they had hatched. And in fact, I think we've talked about this on the show before. That yeah, we have found like juvenile specimens of like various Mesozoic dinosaur groups that were closely related to modern birds, but like they already exhibit like quite large wings and well developed wing feathers, and may have been able to fly very shortly after hatching, which is quite different from the condition in most modern birds. And so yeah, I would guess that it's something that is probably more common in the crown birds. Since some Galoancerans have precocial young, I guess that even though this behavior is exhibited by some members of the group, I guess it's probably not super common in them either. It is quite interesting that the shorebirds though have often gone in this direction, given that, as you said, that they tend to have precocial young as well. I would guess that that probably relates to the fact that a lot of shorebirds have what we might call semi-precocial young, where the young are able to walk very soon after hatching, but a lot of times they'll still stay in the nest anyway for at least a period of time, for like some few days or so. And so that probably means that there is more of a, you know, there's a longer period of time where the young are just staying in one place, and so this kind of behavior would be advantageous. But yeah, like I could see in most of these for most of these factors why they would likely select for kind of the broken wing display over others. So certainly when you talked about like high latitudes, for example, I did suspect that maybe that has to do with like the shorter breeding season, and so kind of nest defense behaviors might be more well developed in the adult birds. And a lot of like the dramatic kind of disparity between high latitude and low latitude ecosystems is most likely more pronounced today than it was in the Mesozoic. Like in the Mesozoic, the climate was generally warmer and all that. So even though there were some time periods in some regions that might have seen snow, especially in the wintertime, probably like the difference between an equatorial habitat versus a high latitude habitat might not have been so stark in terms of like overall temperatures or like the vegetation or such. Obviously, there would have still been some in many cases, but not to the extent that we're seeing in our modern world today. And so, not having those kinds of differences perhaps might also make the broken wing display less likely for most Mesozoic dinosaur groups. Or at least that's what I'd expect. And something else I'll point out here too is that as far as people have estimated, it seems that incubation periods took a lot longer in many Mesozoic dinosaurs compared to crowned birds. I know like some of the larger Ornithischian dinosaurs, like things like the duck-billed dinosaurs, have been estimated where they have to their eggs have to be incubated for months before hatching, and yeah, that's a very long time. Like a huge chunk of the year is devoted to that. And even a lot of the more bird-like dinosaurs, such as like the oviraptorosaurs and troodontids, I think they have also been estimated as requiring longer periods of time than is typical for crowned birds as well. Like not as long as the duck-billed dinosaurs, but still longer than typical for a bird. So yeah, I'd say like most of the factors that they identified here would probably be less likely to favor broken wing displays in most groups of Mesozoic dinosaurs. That being said, obviously exceptions are always the case in nature and weird things happen, so I definitely would not discount the possibility that this display had already evolved in some Mesozoic dinosaur groups, and I would love to see a paleo artist depict that. It would be very interesting. But yeah, no, really, definitely a really detailed and thorough study on a fascinating behavior, and like you said, I look forward to more research, because now that you have this big data set, I think it's definitely a good opportunity for other people or the same people, same researchers, to kind of build on further and study it in even more detail than they have done here. So yeah, really cool.
Absolutely, and like that's really a big aspect of the study that I really appreciated hearing. Just the lengths that the authors went to just make sure they had a good data set. Because they could have just looked at the handbook and we're like, okay, we got our samples done, but they really want to make sure they covered all of their bases and really revealed some neat things. I mean, I think it kind of goes to show the importance of having reviews out there for people to access with.
Yeah.
Because so much information is just scattered about. It's really important to have it all in one place to kind of help synthesize information and make it easier to kind of see what is the state of the field in a certain aspect. And so, which is something that, of course, we've tried to do through Time and Clades, of course.
Yeah.
That we take great pride in, for sure. But yeah, just wonderful stuff. I'm definitely excited to see more on this. But if you like, we can move on to your second story, which that's another one that I'm really excited to hear about.
Sure, we could do that. Yeah, I certainly thought this study was really interesting as well. So this study described a new species of extinct crocodilian, and it is remarkable for several reasons. So, of course, if you're not familiar, crocodilians are the group of reptiles that includes the crocodiles and alligators today. There are about slightly over 20 species of crocodilians that are still alive today, depending on how you split them. However, we know that throughout Earth history, in the time that crocodilians have been around, and modern type crocodilians have been around since at least the late Cretaceous or so. Now, contrary to kind of popular belief, I suppose, it is not true that the ancestors of crocodilians have remained unchanged for the entire Mesozoic or whatever the cliche is. Yeah, crocodilians have undergone a lot of changes in their evolutionary history, and not only that, but there were many different species that were closely related to crocodilians that lived during the Mesozoic that occupied very different niches from the kind of sort of semi-aquatic ambush predator niche that most of them are today. So, like in the distant past, we had like plant-eating crocodilians. We had species that lived on land. We had species that lived out in the open ocean, and we've actually talked about some of those in previous episodes of Through Time and Clades. That a lot of these stem-crocodylians were very diverse in their ecological habits. But that being said, our only living group of the crocodile line archosaurs are the modern type crocodilians, which do indeed mostly occupy a kind of semi-aquatic ambush predator niche, and it seems that have been doing so since the late Cretaceous, but yeah, not since the very beginning of the Mesozoic or anything like that. Now, this new extinct crocodilian is remarkable for several reasons. First of all, it is not one of those kind of crocodilians that lived in the very distant past. This is a recently extinct crocodilian that died out in historical times, and as we shall see, there are like surviving records of like humans having observed this species and interacted with them, and there is evidence for those happenings. For another thing, it is not a crocodile or an alligator. It is what we would call a gavialid. Now, there are two species of gavialids that are alive today. One of them is called the gharial. So this species used to be found across much of southern Asia, but its range has shrunk quite dramatically, and it is now heavily endangered. Now, the gharial is quite a distinctive-looking crocodilian. It is very large. It can grow to like 6 or 7 meters long, something like that. But its most distinctive feature is that it has an extremely long and slender snout. Yeah, like super long and slender. Yeah, if you've never seen a picture of one, go look one up, because they are you can't really mistake them for anything, really. And they are very specialized for feeding on fish with that long, narrow snout. It's very useful for kind of sweeping side to side in the water and snapping up fish. But it also means that they don't usually prey on like larger animals. Like they are almost exclusively fish eaters. They almost never prey on any other kind of animal. Occasionally they will, because animals are flexible that way. Yeah, some people have found like some records of them eating like small, amphibians, or like small aquatic reptiles, like small turtles and such. But for the most part, by and large, they are pretty much entirely fish eaters. And in fact, I've seen in zoos, I've been lucky enough to see gharials in zoos a few times, that they can be housed with like some types of turtles without any issue, and not just like turtles with hard shells for protection, but even like soft shell turtles, for example, which you would expect to potentially be more vulnerable to crocodilian attacks. But yeah, no, like the gharials are very specialized fish eaters and rarely eat any kind of larger prey item. However, there is another species that is currently found in Southeast Asia called, it's sometimes called the false gharial, or sometimes referred to by just its scientific genus name, Tomistoma. As its name suggests, it does resemble the actual gharial in some ways. It also has a very long and slender snout. However, it is not quite as long and slender as that of the true gharial, and so the Tomistoma is actually a much more generalist predator. So it not only eats fish, but also pretty much any other kind of animal it can get its jaws around. There are records of them preying on humans, and they'll also hunt like relatively large non-human mammals like deer as well. And so yeah, the false gharial is a pretty accomplished predator of all kinds of animals and not just fish. So those are the two living species of gavialids that are alive today. And then along comes this one, which was a gavialid that was alive until relatively recent times. So that's quite a surprise. So this recently extinct crocodilian was found in archaeological sites in southeastern China. And it was given the name by the researchers who described it, Hanyusuchus sinensis. So sinensis refers to it coming from China. And Hanyusuchus. So suchus is a common word that is used in scientific names of crocodilians. It basically is Greek for crocodile. And Hanyu was a Chinese poet. Um, and as it turns out, who wrote about these crocodilians in his works. And so, yeah, they were contemporaries of that poet. Now, the fact that Hanyusuchus was a gavialid is pretty significant for a number of reasons. Well, first of all, it means that we actually had like this third species of gavialid that had been living, in recent times all along. But also, its overall anatomy might help us resolve some of the controversies in crocodilian phylogeny, because Hanyusuchus, in terms of its overall appearance, seems to resemble Tomistoma more in terms of like its general proportions. You can look at the picture of the skull here. It certainly has a very long and slender snout, but it is more similar in like its length and slenderness to Tomistoma, and not so much like the very extreme condition in the Gario. However, there are various details of its anatomy, and quite a lot of details actually. You can read more about it in the paper. So I am not a crocodilian researcher, a crocodilian anatomist, and so I'm not super familiar with like the significance of all these different characters, but there are a lot of features in its skeleton that indicate that it was probably more closely related to the true Gario than to Tomistoma. And that is very interesting, because one of the biggest controversies when it comes to the phylogeny of modern crocodilians is the position of the Gario versus the position of Tomistoma. So traditionally, when people only try to infer phylogenies based on anatomical features, it was thought that the Gario was what we call like the sister group, like the closest relative to all of the other living crocodilians, the closest living relative to all the other living crocodilians. And so that means it was like, the odd one out, essentially. Like alligators and crocodiles and Tomistoma were all thought to be more closely related to each other than to the Gario. And Tomistoma specifically was thought to be more closely related to the crocodiles than to the alligators. And that's probably one of the reasons why the name false Gario kind of picked up, because it was like, okay, so it's not really closely related to the Gario, it just kind of resembles it, so we'll call it the false Gario. Well, then molecular phylogenetics came into play, and that kind of changed the view of things quite a bit, because the results from genetic studies have repeatedly found that instead of this traditional idea of the Gario being the most distantly related to all the other living crocodilians, instead, the Gario was found to be most closely related to Tomistoma after all. So in fact, the false Gario is basically Gario adjacent. And these two together, the gavialids, are more closely related to the crocodiles than to the alligators. And so instead of the traditional idea where the Gario was outside of everybody else, instead all the long-snouted modern crocodilians seem to form a group together. And this was like kind of puzzling to a lot of the anatomists who are familiar with crocodilian anatomy, because they had gotten used to the idea that the Gario was like the sister taxon to all the other living crocodilians, and there seem to be a lot of anatomical features that have supported that. However, in recent times, with greater consideration of like the fossil record, and also taking into account the genetic results too, people have started to find morphological support for the idea that, in fact, the Gario and Tomistoma are closely related, and that these two are closely related to the crocodiles. It turns out that if you include a lot of like the fossil gavialids that have been discovered, because even though there are only 2 species today, there are actually quite a few fossil species that are known. Depending on how you analyze the data, you actually can get support for the genetic tree based on morphology. And it turns out that Hanyusuchus seems to add to this evidence, because it was, it kind of has a sort of intermediate morphology between the true Gario and Tomistoma, being like superficially more similar to Tomistoma, but having like details of its anatomy that are more similar to the true Gario, and so it kind of bridges the gap that was previously thought to be there, essentially, that between the anatomy of these two different species, and provides further support for the increasingly what seems to be the consensus phylogeny for crocodilians. That's pretty significant in terms of like the scientific importance of this taxon. But something else that's also really interesting about this species is that we have direct evidence of its interactions with humans in recent times, because it survived again into like very recent history, like for those of us who think about deep time a lot, like it is mentioned in historical accounts, and the authors of this paper actually in their supplementary material actually have a whole table listing like all the examples they could find of mentions of Hanyusuchus in ancient Chinese literature, and there are quite a few. And it seems that the last accounts to mention this species date to the 17th century, and so it probably survived until at least that time. So yeah, very recent, again, from a deep time perspective. But yeah, like again, this was something that survived well into historical times. It's not like some super ancient species that died out thousands or even millions of years ago, and only now has it been given a scientific name. And the fact that it's been mentioned in historical accounts is interesting because first of all, it sheds light on how people viewed this species, which we'll get to, but also it's quite interesting to me as someone who knows the Chinese language, because the only crocodilian that lives in China today is the Chinese alligator. However, in ancient Chinese literature, the Chinese alligator was not called by the name that we use for crocodilians, that we tend to use for crocodilians today in the Chinese language. So there's a character that is pronounced which is used today in Chinese to refer to pretty much all crocodilians, like regardless of whether they are crocodiles or alligators or gavialids. And this character was already used in ancient Chinese literature, but not to refer to the Chinese alligator, which is the only species that still lives in China today. So the Chinese alligator in traditional Chinese text is referred to by a different name, which is no longer used, at least from what I know. Certainly it is not used in many regions anymore. In fact, I think that if you go up to like your average Chinese speaker nowadays and show them this particular character, they're going to go, huh? What is that? Like, what word is that? I didn't recognize that character. But it was used in ancient Chinese text to refer to the Chinese alligator specifically, and it's pronounced tuo, which is very different from the character that was used for that is now currently in use for crocodilians. Nowadays, the Chinese alligator is referred to by in fact, it's specifically called Yangzi, which refers, of course, to the Yangtze River. So it basically means crocodilian from the Yangtze River. But in the ancient Chinese text, that wasn't what they called it. So instead, the term was used to refer to a different species. But until now, that species had been unnamed and unrecognized, at least from a scientific perspective. And so that is super interesting that we had this commonly used character that actually originally referred to an extinct species. And it turns out that that Hanyusuchus had probably a rather different relationship to humans compared to the Chinese alligator, because the Chinese alligator today, it is heavily endangered, and probably in large part due to habitat loss. But it is generally too small to actually prey on people or to prey on like larger livestock. I think it only grows to around 2 meters or so. So obviously it is an alligator, so you don't want to be bitten by one, but it's not that likely to view humans as prey. Whereas Hanyusuchus, on the other hand, it was much bigger, and you can see in the size comparison here that it was much bigger. Like yeah, some of these specimens that the researchers described were on the order of 5 to 6 meters long, and again, it has a tomistoma-like snout. And remember, tomistoma, unlike the mostly fish-eating gharial, is able to take down like prey of all kinds of different types of vertebrates of different types of sizes too. And so Hanyusuchus very well could have been a danger to humans and livestock, and in fact, it probably was because it is mentioned in historical accounts that they attacked humans and livestock. And that poet, Han who the Hanyusuchus is named after, wrote about how he made sacrifices to these crocodilians to, as a ritual to prevent them from attacking people and livestock. Like, I believe he was also a government official, and so he was kind of responsible for these kinds of things, where he would have to like throw like pigs and deer into the water to like appease the crocodilians try and prevent human crocodilian conflicts, um, and. In fact, there was also evidence of these conflicts on the specimens that these researchers described, or at least some of them, because some of these specimens had like these basically injuries in the back of the head that left marks on the skull, and it's most likely that these marks were probably chop marks made by metal implements. So probably someone was really wanted this crocodilian dead and was like hitting it on the back of the head with something sharp and metal. And there was also another specimen that showed like I think like a neck vertebra, like just behind the head, had been like cut. So probably that was something that after the crocodilian had been killed, someone was trying to remove the head. Yeah, so people apparently didn't really like these crocodilians, and not necessarily for unjustified reasons. So probably because of these conflicts with humans, and also because of habitat loss, because of like extensive agriculture being developed in southeastern China at the time, these were probably the main drivers of extinction for this species, unfortunately. It is quite unlikely that it was a kind of climate change issue, because there doesn't seem to have been any like major climate changes that correlate with the loss of the species. And it had died out like much later than a lot of like the other kind of Pleistocene megafauna that is known from Eastern Asia. So yeah, probably it had survived through a lot of like the major climate changes of the Pleistocene. All right. However, once it had made it into historical times, and humans populations were growing and expanding over the landscape and kind of establishing more and more agricultural regions, probably these conflicts became more common, and sadly over time probably the most convenient way for humans to resolve these conflicts was to wipe out the crocodilians. And so sadly we do not have this third species of gavialid that is still with us today. And the other two species of gavialids are, like I mentioned earlier, like they are heavily endangered, and are the subject of a lot of conservation efforts. Like especially kind of regrettable in the case of the gharial, which is not really a danger to humans at all, or essentially not a danger. So yeah, like hopefully we're with our modern understanding of what these animals are like, and of what we can do to help them, we don't lose any more crocodilian species in our lifetime, because they are the last of a very impressive lineage of animals. And certainly even though they might come into conflict with humans at times, they play important roles in their ecosystems as major predators of other animals, and also actually, in fact, their presence actually helps a lot of animals. A lot of birds are known to like nest in regions where crocodilians are common. Like they'll nest in the treetops above lakes where crocodilians live, because that keeps other types of predators away. And so yeah, like the presence of crocodilians actually influences the breeding success of like other species in their habitat. And so yeah, with these as usual with these complex ecological interactions, we often can't predict exactly how the loss of a certain species will affect the environment. And that's why I think it is quite important for us to conserve as many of these species as possible, in addition to, like, of course, the general right to live that essentially all organisms have. So yeah, absolutely remarkable find, I would say. Like a new species, like scientifically unrecognized species, a crocodilian that died out so recently, and not only that, but like a species that is a member of a group with only two living species today, like a very like diversity impoverished lineage, and one that actually has like actual written records of like its interactions with humans. Like these are like remarkable findings. You definitely don't get this kind of thing around, like this kind of discovery every day. So yeah, no, I thought this was a super cool discovery. What did you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just fantastic luck being able to corroborate all these sources together.
Mm-hmm.
It really reminds me of Junji imperialis,
Uh-huh.
which I know we've talked about on the show before. This was a gibbon that was
Yeah.
found in the tomb of Lady Xia, who was the grandmother of the Emperor Qin of the Qin dynasty. And so this is like a new genus and species of ape
Mm-hmm.
that was alive only a little over 2,000 years ago
Right.
that we had no record of at all. And to my knowledge, like there was no written sources of the species like we have for Hanyusuchus.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's just fascinating that we keep finding like these like relatively unique animals like in archaeological contexts.
Right.
they're a whole new species. That's amazing. Um, it's interesting that the records stop around the 17th century
Mm-hmm.
because like that's right about the transition time from the Ming to the Qing
Mm.
dynasties.
Yeah.
And if you know anything about that, like those were really tumultuous
Right.
times, great cultural changes that were underway. So I can certainly see like that contributing to the ultimate loss of this animal,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is a real shame because it sounds like it was a like really impressive crocodile to
Yeah.
like a crocodilian to see in person,
Mm-hmm.
especially given the size. Um, is there any kind of comparable size to this with any like is this about as big as a Nile crocodile or an American alligator or
Yeah,
anything like
it's
that?
that's a good question. I think now I'm not an expert in crocodilian sizes, but I think on average it probably gets bigger than the average American alligator. Um, I think Tomistoma actually gets to around these sizes, and of course the gharial can get at least longer than this. So yeah, it's actually within the precedent that has been set by the modern species of gavialids.
Got it. Okay. But still, though, I mean, like I thought like, that skull is just
Oh yeah,
amazing to look at, and like I'm impressed at the partial completeness of the
right.
remains. I mean, obviously it's not a full skeleton, but I mean you got at least all the limbs, the vertebrae, some of the ribs, the skull, um, that we can actually get like a good that we're actually able to compare it with other crocodilians to
Hmm.
kind of get an identification. Um, I'm actually very curious if an ancient DNA is on the table for
Right.
such new remains as this.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's certainly recent enough that I would expect that someone could probably get some workable genetic sample out of it, and I'd be very curious to see like how that gels with like the morphological inferences about where its phylogeny is. But yeah, the authors of this paper didn't try to take genetic samples, but I suspect the door is open for someone to do it. Um, and I'll just mention that while I'm here that one of the features that Hanyusuchus shares with gharials is that it appears to have like these air chambers in its palate. So gharials have these specialized air chambers in their palate that seem to assist with like sound making, or at least like amplifying or like enhancing the sound that they make. In addition, male gharials also have like a notable weird kind of bulbous organ at the tip of the snout that also seems to have some kind of function in like enhancing sound. Now, Hanyusuchus doesn't seem to have like the big bulb on the end of the nose, but it does have like the air chambers in the palate, seemingly, which would have allowed it to make some interesting calls, probably. And that is one of the ways in which Hanyusuchus is more like gharials than like Tomistoma, actually. And in fact, I think in some of the historical accounts they do mention like, oh, like these calls of crocodilians would like rumble or things like that. And so yeah, it is consistent with like anecdotal reports of the species as well. So that's very cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually a really great segue
Mm-hmm.
regarding DNA
Yeah,
into our final story.
definitely.
So we're going to shift gears away from archosaurs for the
Yeah, it's been
the
Archosaur
remainder
heavy
of
this
this
episode.
episode. Yeah. Hey, which is always good. I appreciate some archosaurs. Um, but like this is one of those stories that just touched me, and like it made me really excited for the future of anthropology.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just had to share it here on this episode. Um, so the need for geneticists and anthropologists to work closely with indigenous groups in every step of their research process remains as vital as ever. As accounted in the recently published and wonderful book Origin, A Genetic History of the Americas by Jennifer Raff, which I had the great pleasure of reading,
Mm-hmm.
Scientists can create positive research outcomes by applying, and I quote, a respect for tribal sovereignty and a prioritization of the community's wishes over scientists' own research agendas, ongoing participation to various extents of community members in aspects of the research, and time taken to build relationships rather than conducting helicopter science. In each case, the knowledge of the past that has been learned from these respectful, reciprocal scientific partnerships has been extraordinary, and we must go in this direction. And so, what a good sign it is to see that such work has been increasing in the last few years. And this study is one such example, and I just had to share it. So, the Mawekma Ohlone tribe are an indigenous group that has ancestral ties to the San Francisco Bay Area. They are members of the larger Ohlone people, who were historically referred to as Costanoans by the Spanish missionaries who first landed there in 1769. They recorded around 15,000 people living in the region within sedentary villages spread out across 45 communities. Of course, California, as a North American culture area, was home to a remarkably great diversity of Native American societies who mostly practiced foraging and spoke languages belonging to several families. So there was a rich diversity here in the valleys and landscapes of California. So the Muwekma Ohlone have had a frustrating history regarding their fight for federal recognition following many years of proselytizing, military incursion, epidemics, and attempts at outright extermination by the Spanish Empire and then the United States. So in 1906, descendants of the surviving peoples were finally recognized by the state of California following an investigation of unratified treaties, which is an unfortunate reality of Native American history, and were henceforth known as the Verona Band of Alameda County. Unfortunately, while Congress passed a bill allowing money to be sent to tribal representatives in the hopes of purchasing back ancestral lands, not enough was gathered, and it was decided in 1927 by the commissioner for the Sacramento Indian Agency, so that's a Lafayette Dorrington, that federal recognition just be dropped altogether, and that technically made everyone homeless.
Mm-hmm.
So by the 1980s, their descendants, who now lived under the banner of the Muwekma Ohlone Tribal Council, decided it would be good to do some background research on their history, especially a lot of their lost history, including a big push to revisit old archaeological sites and burial grounds. And it wasn't until 2006 that work began again to push for the US government to federally recognize the tribe. And it seemed like there was some positive progress for once. But unfortunately, by 2011, their case was lost yet again. And so they've since had to go and reapply again. And one of the key reasons for this was prior anthropological work. So, given the lack of ancient DNA studies on indigenous peoples in the United States, for reasons that I hope should be obvious, attempts to reconstruct past demographic histories have tended to rely mostly on linguistics. And they suggested that the ancestors of the Ohlone peoples were recent arrivals in the San Francisco Bay Area, having entered along a migration of Penutian speaking peoples from the Northeast, which displaced the earlier Hokan speaking groups between about 500 and 1000 AD. And there was archaeological work that also added weight to this, noticing similarities in technologies between Northern California and Western Nevada. And this conflicted with research made by the Ohlone themselves, who had worked with archaeologists on a site of a village that had dated back as far as 490 BC, that is tied to their ancestral heritage. So clearly there was a disconnect here, and the surest fire way to investigate this was to enlist help from ancient DNA researchers. So over the course of a year, the Muwekma Ohlone Tribal Council and community worked side by side with Alyssa Severson and colleagues to extract DNA samples from Ohlone burial sites, including that 2,000-year-old village and a Spanish colonial site. And they both were managed to comprise 12 individuals. And so they compared their signatures with saliva samples from 8 living Ohlone, as well as previously studied samples from across California and the greater Americas, to see if there really was a recent population replacement or not. And it turns out there was a strong signature in the ancient samples that was very closely matched to the contemporary Muwekma Ohlone, supporting a regional continuity over the general San Francisco Bay Area, going back 2,000 years or perhaps longer. The older pre Columbian sites linked up closely with other ancient Californian sites, and despite a recent history of admixture with both Spanish and neighboring indigenous groups like the Miwok and the Yokuts, there was still a detectable genetic thread between the living Ohlone and these very distant ancestors. Now, what's particularly interesting is the linguistic interpretation, which was not necessarily discredited. So, in the genetic analysis, the Ohlone samples clustered more closely with several samples from Southern California. And while the Ohlone speak a Penutian language, the groups in Southern California do not. Thus, the Ohlone are less closely related to other Penutian speakers who live in the Pacific Northwest or the Great Basin. And what this suggests is that this previously argued spread of Penutian speakers was in fact a linguistic diffusion and not a demographic expansion. Now, this is not so far fetched as it might seem. For example, following the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Triple Alliance, there was much less influx of European colonists in Mexico than, say, the eastern United States. There were large numbers of Nahua peoples who remained in the region, despite the loss of the empire and any subsequent admixture with Spanish colonists. And so today, over 1.5 million Nahuas remain and retain their ancestral languages, but 1 million others speak Spanish. If you just looked at this without any of that context and you focused only on the languages themselves, then you might be fooled into thinking that there was a huge influx of Spanish-speaking peoples into the Nahua-speaking population. But as you can see, this was not the case. The Nahuas instead incorporated Spanish into their vocabulary from colonial powers and were encouraged and then forced to speak only Spanish, especially after the 1820s. Now, of course, we can never know for sure what happened to encourage the ancestors of the Ohlone to switch their tongues for a Penutian language, but the genetic evidence, coupled with the linguistic evidence, at least tells us that this switch occurred in the first place. And thus, the Muwekma Ohlone now have evidence to support their case that they are the inheritors of a long-lived indigenous presence in the United States, and their fight for federal recognition can be helped by this information. Now, that fight, as of recording, is still ongoing, of course, And if you'd like to help, we will post a link in the description to the tribe's website, which contains links to their petition, as well as an ongoing collection of information about the Ohlone and their history and culture. It's actually really neat to browse through. And this research is just one of a growing number of examples of ethical, responsible genetic research involving indigenous peoples that benefits everyone. In fact, the tribal council even told the research team that they would be interested in performing more studies of this sort on even older sites so they can better understand their roots, which will surely provide a much clearer picture of the history of California's Native American peoples. And so I thought that this was just wonderful work, very fascinating research. California is one of those regions in North America that we don't have a lot of ancient DNA studies on, but like in recent years, we are slowly building our knowledge base, and already we're revealing fascinating instances, including expansions into Central America that were undetected in the archaeological record up to that point. So there's some really interesting stuff going on there. But I wish all the best to the Moekwa Ohlone, and I hope that our coverage of the story can help in some small way. So yeah, I really like this study a lot. What do you think, Albert?
Yeah, I would agree. It's very gratifying to see this. Like, I mean, I guess nowadays it it feels almost like common sense that yeah, you if you do a study on like a certain group of people, you should involve those people in the study. But obviously, historically, that has not exactly been followed all the time, and oftentimes still isn't. So no, I think it is excellent. This provides an excellent example um, of this kind of cooperation, and they found some really interesting results too. And certainly I think if the indigenous peoples who participated in this study felt that it was a positive experience and that that they're open to future collaborations, I'm certainly looking forward to seeing more of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And like that is, it's like this is part of like a larger, positive trend in the field that people are actually listening to indigenous folks and are taking the necessary steps to create responsible research opportunities involving them. I mean, there's a huge discussion here that has been done that certainly would be appropriate for another day. But I mean, like we have many examples now of indigenous peoples like leading their own studies.
Oh
For
yeah, of
example,
course.
like in fact, just last month actually, there was a study that came out that we'll certainly cover in the next update special for Humanity Prologue. Um, Kenneth et al. 2022. That one of the authors was Maya, and this was a study that looked at Maya ancient DNA samples and revealed some really fascinating insights into the population history of the region. And so, yeah, we have this approach coming from all sides. You have geneticists and anthropologists working with indigenous groups as collaborators, and you have indigenous groups leading their own studies that benefit their communities as well as the greater scientific community. And I hope to see more of this, like in the near future and beyond. It's really remarkable. So yeah, that is basically it for our news episode today. As y'all have seen, a lot of really fascinating news stories and research, and it's always a delight to be able to kind of read outside my general field of expertise every now and then, and kind of just see what's going on in the world
Yeah.
and these new studies in natural history. It's always a treat that we have research like this that we get to that is available to us. Because as far as I'm concerned, like all of these papers were open access,
I think so. Yeah.
which is like it makes it more available to everyone, which I think is fantastic. And of course, it's important that the Ohlone paper as well was open
Yes.
access, which means that other Ohlone can freely access it without having to pay fees or anything like that,
Definitely.
which is very important. That's how it should be. yeah, with that, that is it for us. Of course, if we move to the next slide, we have our general credits. Um, we are on Patreon, of course. So if you're interested in supporting us, you can go to patreon.com/timeandclades, where your contributions will help us continue the series and develop new projects and expansions. At the moment, we have 5 patrons, and all of them are contributing to a tier, which means that they get free shout outs. So we definitely want to give some special thanks to my sister Julie, as well as Paul, Denver, and Laurie. And if we move to our acknowledgments, we can see that our wonderful theme music was provided by our good friend Henry Thomas, and the color scheme for Albert's Alvarezor avatar was Alicia Hutchinson. So we thank them for that. We are on Twitter. You can go to @TimeandClades for updates. Generally, we post announcements for new episodes that are upcoming. But most likely, you are watching us on YouTube. So we are YouTube through Time and Clades. Feel free to like and subscribe and click notifications so you can find out when we release new episodes right when they happen. Of course, if you have any questions for us at all about the news stories we covered on this episode or just anything in general within reason, you can feel free to email us at timeandclades@gmail.com, or you can leave a comment in the YouTube comment section, or you can tweet at us, and we will almost certainly get to that.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, if you're interested in reading the papers that we have talked about today, as well as in many other things that we have mentioned, you can go to our description for links to references for this episode. And with that, that is it for Through Time and Clades. So next time, uh, Albert, should we kind of announce what we're thinking about, or should we keep it more of a surprise?
uh, that's a good question. Yeah, I will say that we are thinking of doing another review episode, but I don't think it's going to be what perhaps anyone watching the show is going to expect. Yeah, it's not going to be a kind of typical review, you see.
Yeah, it's not a movie, not a TV show, not a book. Um, it's like, oh, then what is it? It's like, well, I guess you'll have to wait and see. But we have been planning for it, and so that'll most likely be the next episode
Right.
that'll be forthcoming.
Yeah,
So,
time permitting.
yeah, of course. So stay tuned for that. Um, but yes, we want to thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope y'all have a wonderful day.
Yep. Take care, everybody.